In this video we're going to look at using the Browse tab to work with records. The Browse tab has three major sections. It has the Control section at the top of the pane, it has the List of Records in the middle of the pane, and it has a summary of the record at the bottom of the pane. And I'm going to talk about each of those sections in turn. The Control section at the top lets you decide which records you're going to see in the record view. You can hide most of the controls by clicking the Hide Control button, and that takes away all the filter information that's held in the top pane, or you can show it by clicking again. The next set of buttons are navigation buttons, and these will take you through each of the records that are in the pane below. These buttons are for selecting records, or for marking records, so this will mark all the records. You can see they're all marked, and this will unmark all the records. This button is for designing custom table templates, and the custom table template lets you decide which fields are going to be shown in the table. There's another video about working with custom table templates. This button is an export button, so that'll enable you to export records that you have selected or export the whole data set. We then move on to a couple of buttons here for find and replace. There's a quick find and replace and a more advanced find and replace, a delete button, a button for marking records as hand search, and again there's another video that talks about hand search records. There's a print table button which will give you a printout of the table of records down here, an export to Excel which will export the currently visible fields to an Excel file, and a hide icons column. The hide icons column refers to these columns over here. So in the record display there's a set of icons that give you the status of each of the records, and sometimes you're not interested in that. So you can just click on the hide icon columns and that will take those out of the display. It leaves two, and these are the two columns that show you when a record needs attention, so they're always visible. In this case none of the records need attention. So you can just toggle it back again and that'll bring back all of these columns, and we'll talk about what these columns mean in a few minutes. You can decide which type of record you're going to show in the table by looking at the record category. At the moment we're looking at references. We could equally well look at studies, or we can look at any of the other record types that you've created for yourself. Let's go back and look at references again for now. Within a record category there are record types, and for references that's a set of subtypes that are defined in the Cochrane library. For the moment we'll leave it at all types, so we're going to see all types of records. So all of these buttons here enable you to filter down the records that you're going to see in the record listing here. So at the moment we're looking at references and we're looking at all types, and we've got no filters set. So we can see that we're looking at our whole set of references of 3,279. The columns across here show us the status of the records. We'll talk about them as we go through, but the three that we can see at the moment are worth mentioning. This first column has a red C in it if the record is currently published in Central. At the moment that only applies to references, but you can see from this list of records here that quite a lot of these records are currently published in Central, and it'll be the top ones because that's the way they were read in. When we get further down the list we have quite a lot of references that are not published in Central, so they don't have a red C in this column. Let's go back to the top. This column here tells you whether the record contains a link to another record. So within the CRS all records can be linked to each other in one way or another. This icon tells you that the record is flagged as a hand search record, but a hand search record for your group. So this will be a record that you've discovered via hand searching, but you've also said is a record that you want to include in your specialized register or include in your segment. What we can do is to filter these records based on these sets of columns. So if we wanted to see all records that were in Central and no other records, we can click on this first button here. What that does is filter down the record set to 2605, and if we scroll down and look at the left-hand column, we'll see that every single record has got a red C in it, which means we're looking at only the records that appear in Central. We can take the opposite approach and say we don't want the records that are in Central, but we want all of the records that are not in Central. So if we click on this button, that will toggle that Central selection, and now it's going to show us all of the records that are not in Central. And you can see in the left-hand column, none of the records have the Central flag. These buttons show you whether a record's in your specialized register or not, and I'll come back to that in a little while. These buttons show you whether a record has been modified or not. So when you change a record, it gets a modified flag assigned to it. And this set of toggles lets you pick out all those records that have been modified since you last synchronized. And we can look at that fairly easily by going to a record. Let's go to this record here, and we'll just make a small change in any field really. We'll say let's put something in the year field. We're going to close the record down. It asks if we want to save it. Yes, we do. So as soon as we save it, we see that we've got this blue flag in this column to indicate that that record's changed. And if we wanted to, we can click on this tab here, and that will then filter down to only records that have been changed since we last synchronized. And these toggle buttons work in combination. So what we're saying here is that we want to see all records that are not in Central and all records that have been modified. We can take the toggle off. It doesn't make any difference here because there's only one record that's been modified. But if we take the toggle off here, that shows us all records that have been modified and all records that have not been modified and all records that either are or are not in Central, because these toggle buttons are off. The next filter button lets you filter records on actions. And there's a whole set of actions that you can filter records on depending on what the state of the record is. You can get more information about that function in the help file. We're going to turn it off now because none of the records have actions at the moment because this is a clean data set. Moving on, we could also filter by records that have attachments or don't have attachments. Again, none of the records in this data set have attachments, so that wouldn't be filtering on anything. But if you'd attached PDFs, for example, to a record, you could then filter by just those records that had PDFs associated with them. And the same applies to links. So you can filter by records that have links. So we see as soon as we click that, all of the records now selected, and there's 1,107 of them, all of those records have a link of one kind or another associated with them. We can take the opposite, turn that link off, and that shows us that none of the records have links. Turn that off to return to the full data set. And the same applies to hand search records. We can just look for the records that are our hand search records, and we can look for the records that are not hand search records. Again, we'll turn that off. You can also filter by date. You can filter by the date created or the date last modified. If you filter by the date created, click on the calendar, choose the start date. If you want to add an end date, you can click on the calendar and add an end date here as well. When you're happy with the dates, you click on the Set Browse filter, and that'll go and set the filter on the record set. So let's just click the top one again and see what it is that we get in the bottom window. In the bottom window, we get the citation for the reference. And the citation for the reference is in a standard format when you get the CRS, but you can change the way that citation looks, and you can change the fields that appear in this bottom window by going through the Define Database tab. And again, there's information on how to do that in the help file, and there'll be a help video for that soon. If we're looking at studies, we see in the bottom window the list of references that are attached to that study. Now, most of the references in this data set just have one reference associated with them, but if we click through, we can probably find one that has more. This one has 3. So we have a study here, and it has 3 references associated with it here, and one of those references is in Central. So that's a quick overview of what's going on in the study. The study records, like any other record, if you want to look at in more detail, you can just double-click the record and you'll see all of the tabs that tell you what the details are of that particular record. There's another video that tells you what all of these tabs are, so you can look at the record view. So let's just go back and look at what these buttons for here, these specialized register buttons. We'll go back to References. Within the CRS, you can define a set of records as being in your specialized register. What that means is that you can have a large number of records within your CRS segment, some of which you want to regard as in your specialized register, and some of which you want to regard as not in your specialized register. Some groups regard their specialized register and their central data set as being one and the same thing. Other groups have specialized registers that contain all sorts of records, and it's really up to you to decide how you want to organize that. At the moment, because this is a clean data set and we haven't read in the legacy specialized register for this group, none of the records are in the specialized register, but it's easy to put records into your specialized register. You can simply go and select some records, and we'll just select these 4 at random. You can right-click and choose My Register, and we can say Add Highlighted Records to My Register. So if we click Add Highlighted Records, it asks us to confirm. We say yes, and we see immediately that the flags on these records have changed. So now we've got a specialized register flag in the second column that shows us that these 4 records we regard as being in our specialized register. And we've got the usual modified flag to tell us that something's happened to these records since they were last synchronized, and of course what's happened is that we've added them to the specialized register. We can then make use of these buttons up here, and if we want to just look at the records that are in our specialized register, we can filter by those records. Or if we wanted to look at those that we don't think in our specialized register, we can filter the opposite way. Or we can turn the filter off altogether. So that's a brief overview of the Browse tab. We've looked at navigating through the records. We've looked briefly at what the functions of the buttons are. We've looked at filtering records, and we've looked at how we can get an overview of the citation or of the contents of a study in the bottom pane.